Human Rights Day commemorates the Sharpeville massacre when police opened fire, killing 69 people and injuring 180 others. Many were shot in the back as they fled the police station. To this day, South Africans still face an uphill battle for their basic rights to be respected, and many believe human rights have been overshadowed by disappointments from the state. To discuss if South Africa is making good on the promises of the Constitution to protect and promote human rights, we're joined by Senior Legal Officer from the South African Human Rights Commission, Alex Fitzgerald. Also joining this conversation is human rights and gender equality activist Cathy Mohlahlana. Good evening to you both, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Alex, perhaps let me begin with you, because as the Human Rights Commission, you are in a unique position in that when there are violations of human rights that take place, your organization would be largely responsible for investigating some of these incidents. When you look at what is reported to the Commission, does it give you a sense that we are making the kind of progress that we need to when it comes to affording South Africans with a better life, and that basic, theme being underscored by access to human rights?
Hi, thanks for that question. I think it really depends. So in some instances, we do have indicators that are suggesting that, people are coming to the Commission, they regard the Commission as an entity which can assist them with their complaints, and that we can get results. And I think that we've seen a lot of that with our work in racial discrimination, specifically in South Africa, and really, setting new precedents in terms of consequences for that kind of action and conduct. We are also seeing, some of the issues around, we recently released the VAL reports about the environmental justice, pollution, and the effects that that has on communities and people and well-being. And, those are kind of the new and sort of changing complaints that we're getting, and things that we're increasingly focused on as well, which is sort of differentiating us and diversifying us. As the Commission, we have a very broad mandate, so it's difficult, although some things do not fall into our mandate because there are other entities which are more specific. But I think that the complaints that we're receiving are indicating to us that we've made progress in a number of cases, and also telling us that the future holds new challenges for human rights, and some of the environmental complaints that we've received are a good indication of that.
Ricky, in terms of human rights, and we'll speak specifically about women here, that situation doesn't seem to be changing much at all. If anything, we seem to be regressing.
Good evening, Cathy, and good evening to your viewers. Thank you for having me this evening. And indeed, when it comes to women's rights, I think that not only are we regressing, we're not managing to make effective progress. So when we talk about gender equality, there are two big areas that come to mind. The one is the issue of gender-based violence, and as we have seen in the country in the past 2-3 years, we've got increasing incidents of gender-based violence. In the COVID context, there's been an increasing incidence of gender-based violence, and we have had an increasing awareness. I think when it comes to talking about human rights, the problem that we have is, though we have legislation, what we need to be focusing our attention on is how do we change culture? How do we change the belief systems and the behaviors in society? Because legislation is not going to do that. Legislation requires me to bring a case to protect my rights. It doesn't, in fact, call upon other citizens to behave in a way towards me that is respecting of my rights. And I think that's the challenge that we have faced in South Africa, the implementation challenge we always talk about.
And Alex, why do you think there is such a low compliance rate, that it is often when people get caught out, where there's legal action, that you will see steps being taken to make sure that people's human rights are respected? That doesn't seem to be the point of departure. That how does this decision that we're implementing right now affect the various rights of the individuals who are involved?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I think that there are several causes for this. It is part of our fabric of a society, and I think you can obviously go back to colonialism and apartheid, and the current context of inequality, poverty, and violence in South Africa, which all compounds this idea of there is no consequences for actions. No one is held accountable. Our state is not perceived to be accountable. Our politicians aren't always perceived to be accountable. And so it sort of all lends to compounding this idea that you don't have to respect other people's rights because there will be no consequences for that. And, that is a difficult needle to shift because we are in a difficult context. As Ricky points out, COVID-19 has come and compounded many of the issues that we already had. It was already going to be a tough year for South Africa when we entered this pandemic and the consequences of lockdown, which are again disproportionately impacting women, disproportionately impacting lower income communities, the marginalized queer communities, migrants, sex workers. Individuals who were already very vulnerable and marginalized in our society, I think have become even more vulnerable and even more marginalized. So, it's an incredibly difficult context, and I think that explains why we just have this culture of non-compliance. And I think that there's also been just a legacy of disappointment as well, which is something that we need to acknowledge, I think, across the board about, what people's expectations are and should be in terms of our Constitution.
At the end of the day, the Constitution needs to mean something to the people of South Africa. What happens in a situation as you're describing where there's limited delivery, there's great disappointment? Many people, of course, will become disillusioned with what is promised. What are the dangers of that in our society, Alex?
I think that we're very much seeing the dangers. Ricky has talked about our gender-based violence rates. It's completely unacceptable. It's crisis. We are seeing, the police brutality that we have seen during the lockdown period as well is another instance of that failure. So I think that, and the violence in our communities and in our country, from all quarters, is all sort of testimony to the areas in which we are not sufficiently vindicating the rights of the Constitution. The fact that South Africans and people in South Africa more broadly are living in fear as a general proposition. All of these are, it's not to be doom and gloom, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge the nature of the problem that we are experiencing. And it's important for us to stay in touch with the communities and what people are going through every day in their lives as South Africans, so that we can really try and focus and target the resources that we have to alleviating some of those burdens.
Ricky, just bringing you back in here, Alex is talking about needing to understand what the conversations in communities are and staying in touch with those communities so that their agenda also forms part of the government agenda. When it comes to the issue of gender-based violence, there's no confusion about how serious it is in South Africa and just the pandemic that we're facing, and yet when we look at the actual change of behavior, it doesn't seem to be shifting, at least not in the right direction.
Yes, Cathy. I think the challenge is twofold. Number one, it's about understanding what is required to get behavioral change. People don't change their behavior simply because they know they should. They change their behavior because it aligns with their belief systems. So what we have to understand is that the behavior that we see around gender-based violence, or in another context, a disrespect of human rights, comes from a historical context where indeed we didn't have the conditioning and foundations of respect. And we have perpetuated that, even in a post-94 South Africa. So we have to put in the systems that are teaching new perspectives, the systems that are teaching new ways of behaving, and the systems that allow us to unlearn, all of us, women and men, and unlearn because we're perpetuating the oppression that underlies and that underlies the drivers of gender-based violence. I think the second thing that needs to be borne in mind is this kind of deep societal change can't happen simply because there is a written law. It can't happen because there is a policy. All the different institutions in society need to be contributing to this change. Every institution needs to understand it as their responsibility. And I think few people understand that our Constitution does require a positive promotion of the right to equality, a positive promotion of several of the rights. They don't understand that it's not just requesting the right from the state or expecting the state to deliver. We also have a responsibility. And I think shifting that discourse to what is my responsibility? What is the work that I have to do to understand how I am perpetuating an old system of oppression? And really working with the different institutions of society, be they the workplace, the church, civil society, to really reach as many people as possible, I think is where we will begin to see a change in behavior.
We're going to continue with this conversation, speaking to Senior Legal Officer from the South African Human Rights Commission, Alex Fitzgerald, and Human Rights and Gender Equality activist, Ricky Minyuku. This is News at Prime. Do stay with us. It's 6:30, a quick look at your headlines tonight. The Health Ministry confirms South Africa has successfully concluded the sale of its first consignment of the AstraZeneca inoculations. Now, President Ramaphosa uses his Human Rights Day address to appeal to the public to be patient with the country's COVID-19 vaccine rollout. And meetings are scheduled this week about who will ascend to the throne to become king of the Amazulu nation. And relief for Kaizer Chiefs fans as their side walks away with the bragging rights over Orlando Pirates. Today's Soweto derby marked the 100th league encounter between the two sides. While Human Rights Day commemorates the Sharpeville massacre when police opened fire, killing 69 people and injuring 180 others. Many were shot in the back as they fled the police station. And to this day, many South Africans still face an uphill battle for their basic rights to be respected. And many believe that human rights have been overshadowed by the disappointment from the state. Well, let's talk about it further tonight. We're joined by the South African Human Rights Senior Legal Officer, Alex Fitzgerald, and Human Rights and Gender Equality activist, Cathy Mohlahlana. Thank you so much for staying with us tonight. I want to shift the conversation slightly, because we really cannot talk about Human Rights Day without reflecting on how we even got here in the first place. And the Sharpeville massacre was a turning point in terms of how the world approached human rights and, establishing some kind of order for international human rights recognition. There are communities in Sharpeville, in Langa, and those are communities that are still living with the scars of the brutality that they experienced. Do you think that there is something that is owed in particular to those communities? Because we'll never really fully know the kind of trauma that many have been living with. Alex?
Obviously, I'm here in my capacity representing the Commission, but in my personal opinion, I would love to, say those communities and many communities in South Africa really do deserve reparations and really do deserve to be made whole again. Apartheid was absolutely characterized by, a violent brutality and harassment. It was a constant everyday experience. I believe that a lot of South Africans are traumatized by, the time under apartheid, and even previously before that under colonialism. And I think that, those wounds are very deep and very difficult to heal, and that trauma really does get passed down to the next generation as well. It's for many South Africans, day-to-day life is very difficult. It's very dangerous. It's very scary. And, it's a literal hand-to-mouth situation. So I think that, it's really, really important for us to acknowledge the deep wounds of communities like Sharpeville. But it's not just Sharpeville. There are many communities which are experiencing this deep pain and this deep hurt, and who feel that they haven't really truly been acknowledged in the process of our reconciliation. So I would love to say yes in the context of such scarce resources in South Africa. It's difficult, I think, to know, as a commissioner, I can absolutely testify that there are so many human rights issues in our country that it's almost difficult to even prioritize, to even know, which one, how can you classify one as more urgent or as a higher priority than the other. It's really almost an impossible and unethical thing to do. So, I personally would say yes, but, the acknowledging the constraints of our reality.
Ricky, how do we move from this conversation? Because often, when I listen to what Alex is saying, that is something that will often be used even by government officials, saying, well, so many people have suffered in this country. But in saying that, they almost postpone having to deal with the conversation, that it's never had in the way that it needs to happen, so that these communities actually have some kind of resolution or even closure over what their future should look like, especially weighed against their own expectations.
Yes, thank you, Cathy. So I think that the issue is about how we view reparations, and often what leads to a postponement of the discussion is reparations is seen as a cash transfer to particular individuals. But there are many different ways to look at reparations. For example, we could be talking about institutional reparations. Institutional reparations in the sense that we establish institutions in this country that work. Because I think one of the biggest challenges is we do have human rights which we have a claim against the state, but we have institutions that don't work. So an investment in institutions that ensure protection. Another way to look at reparations is to look at ritual reparations in particular communities that have suffered extensive trauma, and to engage with those communities in a way that gives them agency and gives them voice, and it enables them to say, so this is how we're walking out of that past. But in order to do that, I think there needs to also be an examination of what the state is capable of, the skills and the values within our state institutions, and how do we equip our institutions to do the bare minimum of protecting human rights.
I want to bring the aspect of children's rights into this conversation because often there are many violations where children are concerned, and because you won't see a protest that is led by minors in the streets, some of these issues are very often neglected. So let's speak about children and how much of their rights come to dominate the agenda. And even in the context of COVID-19, we've really seen in some instances children being the ones that are bearing the brunt of the implications of this lockdown. You know, we're talking about families that have lost jobs. It's children who some perhaps are not going to school in the way that they would before. They're having to be aware of the changing situations in their homes, but also in their communities. Ricky?
So I'd first like to say that they are amazing young people in this country, children and youth who are doing amazing work advocating for the rights of children. But I think that the biggest place that we have failure of children's rights is failure again. We have a rights system that is not brought to life because we set up the policies, but we don't set up the mechanisms to ensure that those policies are implemented. And what we need to do is to be listening more and more to the young voice and the youth voice. I think around children's rights issues, they are, because of the social media context we live in, they're more connected to the global debates, which are really deepening the issues of inequality and the issues of human rights violations that than is the understanding that we currently have in South Africa. So there's a huge scope to be learning from and hearing from children. And there is, I think, a significant amount of work that can be done. When you think just about the state institutions that interface with children, that is schools, that is the health department, that is the Department of Social Development. There's huge scope for just improving the institutional capacity at that level, which then enables children to be reached and to be met. In the COVID context, children have faced a huge amount of the burden and have really been at the coalface of the inequality that we see in South Africa. If you think just about the educational context, the picture has been stark in terms of access to meaningful education in the last year because of COVID-19. And the children have raised their voices and said this is not fair. They have shown that we have a digital gap. They have shown the gender inequality and the disproportionate impacts on girl children. It's just, are we listening as a society?
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, totally to echo everything that Ricky said, she said it beautifully. I think that, you know, from our context, we are still getting over the hump of really convincing people in South African society that children are autonomous human beings who have rights and who are deserving of respect. And I think that you see that just even from the reaction to the Constitutional Court's judgment, saying that hitting your children is no longer, permitted, that is illegal, that is abuse. And you see the outrage that follows that, and you recognize that within our society, we still have a long way to go in changing our culture about how we see children. You know, they are not things that are owned by us or our property. They are, independent human beings, and they have rights. And, they're an absolutely vulnerable group. It's very difficult for them to make complaints to bodies like the Commission or other bodies, to reach out for help when they need it. And they really are bearing the brunt of this. But I will say that I totally agree as well. They are amazing. It's one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about the youth in South Africa. I feel like they're really pushing the needle of the agenda. Many people like to complain about the so-called entitlement of younger generations. And, as a constitutional lawyer, I am absolutely all about that entitlement. The rights are entitlements. We do have entitlements, and they are detailed in our Constitution. And I really believe that the youth are the ones who are going to push for the vindication of those rights, to demand that, that the states and the institutions that are funded by the state do better, and do better by them, because there are things that they are entitled to in terms of our Constitution that they are not receiving, or they are not receiving the quality of it that they should be. And, that goes for education, healthcare, food and nutrition. All of these are issues in our country, and many of them shouldn't be. And, you can't help but be frustrated by the constant, reports of corruption, because, that is clearly infringing and impinging on the state's ability to deliver on its constitutional obligations. And that is a constant source of frustration for every South African.
All right, let's leave it there for tonight. Let me thank you both for your time. Senior Legal Officer to the South African Human Rights Commission, Alex Fitzgerald, and Human Rights and Gender Equality Activist, Riki Minyuku.